Nope. There we go. Great. Well, first, let me start by thanking you for inviting me to speak at the hearing. And I know we've had previous conversations on the about this topic, so it's near and dear to my heart. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through try to go through very quickly some of the federal programs that fund broadband. And there are a lot of federal programs, more than you really want to hear about, and so that's part of the challenge. The first two, and the FCC, you've heard some of that already today, but the FCC and USDA programs are explicitly broadband programs. One of the points to make is that there are federal resources which can be applied to broadband or broadband infrastructure, and they do not have the word broadband in it. So I'll give one example in this presentation. Oops, let me go back. Well, first, you've heard about the Connect America Fund, and the overall funding in 2014 was $3.75 billion. I'm just going to give you a quick synopsis so you get an idea of the scale of the dollars, and these are national dollars. It was capped at $4.5 billion a year, and as you've heard, the purpose of it is to subsidize the cost of operating and extending infrastructure for both fixed and mobile to consumers and small businesses in rural, high-cost areas. They have that $4.5 billion budget. Phase 2, which you've just heard about, of Connect America, and the allocation of up to $1.8 billion a year to geographic areas served by larger telecommunication carriers. So Commissioner Sandoval just discussed this interaction and the aspect of Verizon and Frontier. They actually just announced within the last month that agreement of the 10 larger telecom carriers across the country to accept this $1.5 billion annual support for rural broadband development. Over a 6-year period of that agreement, that's $9 billion from the Connect America Fund. And then you will assume that the carriers will add some of their own resources, so there is a multiplier effect of the dollars invested. You already heard the discussion about Verizon, and I guess the CPUC has already accepted this transfer between Verizon and Frontier, which then that was the condition that Verizon had set on their acceptance of the Connect America funds, that this be approved. It's now approved, so that's going to go forward. There's a mobility fund which provides up to $500 million a year to support deployment and maintenance of mobile broadband, and you've already heard some reference to the challenges there. So mobile broadband and voice service in high-cost areas. Again, the goal for the FCC is to expand mobile broadband coverage in rural and unserved areas of the country. There's another program, the E-rate program for schools and libraries. It's capped at $3.9 billion, and the cap is adjusted for inflation every year. And I think you're probably going to hear more about it after me, about how that applies to California. But it provides discounts of up to 90% for broadband to and within elementary and secondary schools and public libraries in both rural and non-rural areas. So that's kind of a synopsis of those programs. There is a small FCC rural healthcare program. It was funded at $193 million, or dispersed in 2014 and capped at $400 million a year. That's an opportunity for rural healthcare providers to access that fund, because one of the issues, and if you have a more detailed discussion about broadband in rural areas, it's all these different layers, and one of them being telehealth, telemedicine. And they probably have the higher bandwidth needs. So you raise this issue of the standard, probably the highest need is on the telemedicine, telehealth side of things. That program, the program they will provide up to 65% of the cost. The rest the applicant has to provide for that. If you look at USDA, and we've already had the discussion about how the Rural Utilities Service is the historical successor of the Rural Electrification Service or agency that basically in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, and I guess really even to now, brought electricity to rural areas across the U.S. The successor of that, the Rural Utilities Service, operates basically 4 different programs. 2 of them are loans, and I'm not going to talk too much about them. There's a telecommunications infrastructure loan program and a farm bill broadband loan program. And essentially, the focus is on rural communities of a population of 5,000 or less. It's used for construction, expansion, and acquisitions and refinancing. The telecommunications program, there is $690 million available nationally last year. So it's really, if you divide it up to the need, it's basically oversubscribed. There's another program, the Farm Bill Broadband Loan Program, which its focus is on communities that are unserved or underserved. You have to show that at least 15% of households are unserved. There's also special consideration given for projects in tribal lands, which is a consideration particularly for California. But it's a fairly small program. These are all run by the national office, so they don't run through the USDA California Rural Development Office. The grant program, the 2 different grant programs that USDA has is there's the Community-Oriented Connectivity Grant Program, which is a very small national grant program. It's $10.4 million was available in 2015, and that was nationally. So you can see how that will be oversubscribed. So if you're thinking about the congressman's bill, that could be an area that an existing program that they might want to look at in terms of the funding for it. Again, this program, it's focused on rural areas, so that we define, in this case, rural eligible areas as an area with a population of less than 20,000 and broadband speed, and they change it every year, but it's specified in the notice of fund availability. It's a pretty slow speed, actually. That's the way the program is set up now. The maximum grant is $3 million. It requires a 15% match from the applicant. It also requires that there be free broadband at a community center available and any community anchors such as government buildings or fire stations for that program. I think it's actually a nice program. It's just really too small to, you can see the whole $10 million would disappear into a part of a county in California, much less the entire region or the state. There is a distance learning and telemedicine program. The focus of that, it's not for broadband infrastructure, but it is the recognition of telemedicine and distance learning and provides funds for the equipment and software and training to connect to that broadband infrastructure so that you can utilize telemedicine or distance learning is actually the way to think about that. The award amounts in those programs are from $50,000 to $500,000. Again, this is all run out of the national office. For those who are interested in these programs, the point of contact is actually, we have in California what we call a general field representative who represents the national office for all the broadband programs. And I'll just give you his name just for the record. It's Rocky Chenille. He is the GFR Telecom Rural Development Representative for California. And his, I guess I'll give you his email. It's rocky.chenelle@wdc.usda.gov. And any questions about the programs, because they run essentially on an annual basis, but the rules are constantly being adjusted. And right now, there's a lot of, because the full federal funding hasn't been solidified yet, so you have to talk to them and find out the latest as to what is happening with those programs.
Could I ask you a question about the program? You said he's sort of point of contact for these programs. Is there any effort at the federal level to coordinate this so that, I guess I go back to, and it's going to, I know as Connie Stewart comes up and Lewis Fox, I'm going to go back to, it's like, we've got all these different resources out there, and it just feels like we have no coordination, and we feel like we need sort of a one-stop shop where a proponent for a project could come in and sit down with the federal government, sit down with the state, sit down with people and say, this is what I need, this is the merits of the project.
Right.
How do we put all this together in a single process where we can actually move a project rather than trying to go after this portion of a $10 million grant or this portion of that? It just seems I don't have words for it. It's just if I had more hair, I could continue to pull more hair out. But I don't understand why we haven't progressed to that point at this point.
There is some effort to do that, and in fact, the NTIA actually has come out with I guess you could call it a booklet, which goes through and lists all the federal programs that could be applied to broadband. So there is an effort to do that. Part of the challenge is there's not really, I would say, an individual who knows all of those pieces because there's so many programs. But this book is there, and that's a starting point. And then you would go to the individual agency. But you have pointed out that, that is a need to have a single spot. We do it to a certain extent nationally within USDA. All the rural broadband coordinators, we talk to each other maybe every 3 months, just within the USDA side of things. But that is it's a real challenge. And then the flip side, of course, also is on the state and local side to those pieces. What I have found in just in my personal experience is that I've identified these programs, and there are programs that are not broadband programs.
Right.
And this one actually is one that some people may not have thought of with the Economic Development Administration at the Department of Commerce as an example, because it is not a broadband program. It is a program for it's a grant program for economic assistance.
Right. And I'm not saying that to poke at anybody. I was at the NTIA conference in Palo Alto recently and met with, we had someone from the federal government speaking about that. And it just, in my mind, it kind of redefined the silos rather than a solution. So a book is a great solution, but to have somebody who can sit down with locals, sit down with the state, sit down with the proponents of a project, and actually work through a process just seems like a lot more efficient way of getting these things off the ground, rather than trying to find out what might apply in a manual or whatever. I
would say that because I have worked on a cross federal government project that is a White House project called Strong Cities, Strong Communities. And Fresno was a city that was in that project where all the federal agencies were designated to work together, and I was the USDA lead on that. And you're exactly right to the point that this is really how the federal government should work. In order for that to happen, it's got to be driven actually from the very top, the White House, in order to do that. Otherwise, it sort of depends on people in my position to work across, which I do, to like the Energy Department or US HHS, but it's kind of it's not set into the structure.
I understand it's somewhat frowned upon.
Well, it depends on how much you're.
That was the impression I got anyway. So someone who wants to work out to branch out beyond what they're to try to pull something together isn't exactly encouraged. So.
Yeah. But the example, I'll just finish with this before I go on the last piece on the EDA grants. This is the focus for EDA is on economically distressed communities, which is a lot of the rural areas would fall into that. And they have a definition based on either unemployment or per capita income lower than the national average, and these different slices. But it is set up to, you can do a broadband infrastructure application. You can also do planning grants through them. And in many cases, the first step is to do the planning grant and the assessment of the area, so you create the rationale. Once you've done the planning, the results of that do not necessarily have to be used with EDA grants, but can be used as the justification for, say, CETF application on the state side, or coming to USDA and rural development. Here you've got this planning grant. It helps with that grant application to USDA. I want to finish up with the biggest opportunity, and we might have already discussed this, I think, on FirstNet, the opportunity. But actually, outside of the conversation that we had, what I have found is that nobody outside of the public safety officials actually seem to have heard about FirstNet. And I was just last week at the Partnership for the San Joaquin Valley, and that consists of members of cross-section of the 8 counties of the San Joaquin Valley, political and civic leaders there, and some of the state secretaries. They are appointed by the governor. So I asked the question, has anyone heard of FirstNet? Not one single hand went up. And you're talking about broadband, you're talking about finding all the different resources. FirstNet represents this opportunity for us on the public safety side. And that slide sort of captures one of the reasons on the human side of public safety. That was a FedEx collision with a bus carrying high school seniors on their way up to Humboldt State to visit about a year plus ago. And one of the things about that incident was that the 32 students that were sent to hospitals, and where that accident occurred was roughly where there's 4 county jurisdictions. And the 32 people were sent to 10 different hospitals. And there was no electronic record of who got sent where. The only record was by chance that one of the first ambulance drivers who got there took a piece of notebook paper that he happened to have in his car and wrote down the names of the individuals and where they were sent to. That was the only record. So you can imagine that what that meant was the families of those students, there's a couple more hours before they could figure out where their son or daughter was sent. So that's an example directly of the human need to have this better public safety system. The other one, which I think everybody here would be familiar with, is fires, the natural caused disasters. And you see the concentration of fires up there on the top. But that's a real communication need on the public safety side. When we were out on our trip in October, I guess, is when we came up and we saw you, when we met with the Forest Service rangers in the area, and they told us that those 2 fires, the Six Rivers and the Trinity Forest Fire, I think, they're somewhere between 200 and 400 people living in different places throughout the forest. No communications, no telephone, nothing, no cell phone service. So those fires are spreading very fast. They had to go and divert the Forest Service resources that normally would fight fires to notify each one of those persons individually to get them out. Unfortunately, they were able to do it before the fires got there. But you can imagine there were 2 things. One, this lack of communications meant you lost a lot of real time to get those individuals out. If those fires had spread faster, there could have been actual deaths involved. And the other was that tied up their resources for a day before fighting those fires. And you can figure out very quickly for each day you're delayed, fire spreads. So that gets you to the realization that on public safety we have real needs for broadband communications. And the positive disruption, if the fires are a negative disruption, if the drought in California is a negative disruption, but certain positive things can happen, we have FirstNet coming about. And FirstNet is a public safety system that is derived from the lessons of 9/11, when the lesson of 9/11 in communication is that the New York City police and fire departments could not communicate with each other inside the towers because their radios were on incompatible frequencies. And you can imagine just exactly what happened partially as a result of that. So the lesson and the law passed was to create a high-speed, nationwide, wireless broadband network dedicated to public safety, all first responders, where you have a single platform and they would be able to have instant communication by voice, digital, and video. So this would be state-of-the-art. They've set aside spectrum, the FCC has, at this apparently the optimal spectrum for this type of communication. This is going to be funded by an initial $7 billion. The RFP for it should come out next month for $7 billion. And it's being funded from spectrum auctions, which means it is not subject to congressional appropriations, the best part of it, because in contrast to the rural broadband, which is congressional appropriations. So the money is there. It will come out, and the estimate is there could be as much as, over time, $43 billion potentially from these spectrum auctions. So this is a huge opportunity. And the process on this chart up here, there's the 3 levels on their timeline for FirstNet. The top chart shows, I just talked about the RFP development, which is done in Washington, D.C. FirstNet is a semi-independent part of the Department of Commerce that is administering that. The middle chart shows the FirstNet consultation engagements. The lead, this is divided up by state, actually. So California and every state is working on its own FirstNet broadband strategy. And they are in the process, they're having consultations, outreach, and they're drafting a state strategic plan for that. And it's the Office of Emergency Services, and Karen Wong is the single point of contact for that, to develop that. They will, when they're finished with the plan, send it to the governor, and then the steps will go to here, where at some point next year, all the states, through their governors, will either opt in or opt out to the $7 billion of funding. And eventually, the goal is by 2022, FirstNet will be in operation. The objectives that they're using for FirstNet to define it, public safety user population, public safety high-risk areas of interest, population where it is, developed areas, roadways, and specific to rural areas, tribal lands, a rural metric, and federal lands, which actually is our opportunity for input into this system. Now, I would say here's the rural opportunity to get on board. That one, I just talked about those 2 examples of public safety in rural areas. So there's an opportunity through FirstNet to get improved public safety communications for rural first responders. Second, there's an opportunity to define rural public safety, because public safety is not defined in the law. It is left open for us to define. So it's left open for us to have the input to go to, say, in this case, OES, to say, this is how we would define public safety from a rural or urban perspective. The 2 leverage points, and this goes back to when you're talking about all these resources and the silos. This is an opportunity to leverage FirstNet broadband investment to improve rural broadband infrastructure with other resources, exactly cutting through the silos, this opportunity. But that opportunity is only there if we drive through it. It's not going to automatically happen. And at the same time, if you leverage from a different perspective, it's an opportunity to leverage development of rural community broadband. And if you look at rural public safety definition, and I just put some examples up there on the chart. I won't read through all of that. But, and each time I show it, someone else, actually there was
something to add to it.
Stewart added a piece, I think it was Key Bridges, to that. On this, the thing I want to focus on, just to mention, is down on the right side, disaster evacuation and staging areas, or at fairgrounds, at county fairgrounds across the state. That's something that I think is a critical piece out there. It is a statewide impact. There's 74 county fairgrounds. And that's something that actually would fit into, there's AB 238 broadband legislation, which is before the legislature right now, and there are some amendments that were submitted on December 4th, directly relevant to FirstNet and public safety and those county fairs, because essentially it would authorize the county fairs to be included into the kind of funding jurisdiction over that CPUC would have over funding. And that's an example of if you're looking at trying to stitch together the pieces, that's a specific stitching together of the pieces out there on the state side and then correlating to what the FirstNet dollars on the federal side to do it. The reminder is on broadband and FirstNet that we have to make is that even if 96% of the state is urban where they live, 95% of the state is rural by geography. You don't get a ubiquitous broadband system or FirstNet system without getting into the rural areas. If you were to do an action plan, part of what needs to be done is to make sure that rural FirstNet gets the same priority as urban. And it's important because the reason for FirstNet was the lesson of 9/11, and 9/11 was in New York City. You can't get more urban than that incident. But there are equal needs on the rural sides. I would say developing this rural-based definition of public safety, if you define public safety using this rural-based definition, then FirstNet's going to get to those areas to serve that need, which gets you to creating a rural FirstNet strategy and making sure, and this again is cutting across the silos, to apply a multi-benefit strategy to FirstNet, that it's not only, we recognize the importance of public safety, but those dollars can also be leveraged with other dollars so you would get a greater benefit for it. And I think it's important to do that because we don't actually have enough resources for single benefit on anything these days. And then going back to what I talked to before, we could actually create these rural community and county fair FirstNet pilots to drive things. This chart ties all the pieces together. It's basically the point that we've talked about before about rural broadband and all the different layers from new ag technology to rural telehealth, telemedicine, distance learning, public libraries, transportation, agritourism, market access, and public safety. All these layers are tied to broadband. So those are the multiple benefits and multiple uses. And then finally, on this rural-urban broadband interface, it is not rural only or urban only. They're all interlinked. And that chart up there captured that, both for public safety and FirstNet, but I laid in the other pieces that you've also heard about.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I really, really appreciate it. I'm just curious, when did the legislation, when was that introduced and passed that led to FirstNet? Was that?
It was, I think, a year after 9/11. So it's taken a while to get it to the.
So we may be 20 years from 9/11 before we get to this.
Well, they're in the implementation stage now. So the first tranche, the $7 billion, the RFP is going out in January. Mm-hmm. So that $7 billion will be available for the states to apply for in 2016. The goal is that the system be turned on in 2022. I would say if you want to do what California's fair share ought to be of that $7 billion, 10% of that, or $700 million, would not be a stretch.
Okay. And
$700 million for California broadband is more than any other source out there that I can think of.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Very much appreciate it. So we're going to bring up Connie Stewart and Louis Fox, and I know we're probably running a little behind here, and I apologize. Well, I will stay around for public comments, so I don't want to shortchange anyone, but I want to appreciate everybody's attention and thank you. And I apologize that I can't help myself. I just ask questions, and